The little girl's bike skidded to a stop on the gravel as the roar of approaching engines shook the quiet afternoon, and her loyal police dog stiffened beside her, muscles coiled like wire. Something primal flashed in his eyes, an instinct sharpened by training and a bond deeper than words. The bikers fanned out, their shadows swallowing the sunlight, while the dog leaned forward, sensing a threat she couldn't yet see. His ears twitched, his breath slowed, and then he made a sudden, deliberate signal, one he had only ever used in moments of extreme danger. But what had he detected that she hadn't? Ava Hartley had always been a quiet, soft-spoken 9-year-old, the kind of child who preferred sketching flowers on her porch over the noisy games other kids played in the street, and her closest companion in the world was Atlas, a retired police K-9 whose sable coat and solemn amber eyes made him look both fierce and impossibly gentle at the same time. He had been her father's partner once, a disciplined, hyper-focused German shepherd trained for search, protection, and detection. But when a joint injury ended his service early, he had settled seamlessly into the rhythm of family life, becoming Ava's shadow, guardian, and silent confidant. Their days followed a peaceful, predictable routine: early morning walks along the wooded trail behind their house, afternoons spent in the yard where Ava read while Atlas sprawled protectively at her feet, and evening bike rides along the gravel road that led to the old bridge where she liked to toss stones and watch the ripples spread across the water. Theirs was a friendship built on softness and instinct, her gentle nature mirrored by his steady vigilance, and though Ava's parents often joked that Atlas watched her more closely than any adult ever could, the truth was that he seemed to sense every shift in her mood, every tremor of unease, long before she ever voiced it. As the summer grew warmer, however, Atlas began to exhibit a subtle change, one Ava noticed before anyone else. On their walks, his ears twitched toward the distant highway with unusual tension, his nose lifted as though catching scents that didn't belong, and he would occasionally glance behind them with a sharp alertness that broke the tranquility of the forest path. At first, Ava assumed he was reacting to wildlife, maybe a fox or a stray dog, but his rigid body language felt different, colder, focused, almost tactical. Even in the yard, he lifted his head abruptly at the faintest engine noise, stepping closer to Ava with a quiet, measured protectiveness that made her feel both safer and strangely unsettled. Her parents brushed it off as leftover habit from his working days, a dog with instincts too finely honed to fully relax. But Ava sensed something more, an invisible thread of tension tightening around them little by little. One afternoon during their usual bike ride, Atlas paused on the gravel road and stared down the empty stretch, as if expecting someone to emerge from the shimmer of heat rising off the pavement. His tail lowered, his stance braced, and a faint rumble vibrated in his chest, not aggressive but warning, as though telling Ava to stay close. She reached out instinctively, resting a small hand on his ruff, and felt the steady thud of his heart beneath her fingertips. A heartbeat strong enough to protect her yet quick enough to betray that something had shifted. She tried to shrug it off, continuing their ride, but the image lingered in her mind long after they returned home. Atlas standing motionless, gaze fixed far away, his entire body aligned toward a threat she could not see. Over the next week, the signs grew harder to dismiss. Engine noises seemed to echo more frequently along the rural road, low and distant but persistent. Neighbors quietly mentioned unfamiliar motorcycles passing through the area, groups riding fast and loud at strange hours, and each time the rumble reached their property, Atlas reacted in perfect, precise stillness, the kind of readiness he hadn't shown since the days he wore a badge. Ava didn't understand what any of it meant, doesn't yet know how tightly the threads of danger were weaving around her life, but she felt Atlas's unease as clearly as her own breath. Something was coming. Something he sensed long before anyone else did, and though neither of them knew it yet, those quiet summer evenings, those peaceful routines, were about to be shattered in a way that would test the limits of loyalty, courage, and the unspoken bond between a child and the dog who would do anything to protect her. The first real crack in their peaceful routine appeared on a windless Thursday evening, when the fading light stretched long shadows across the gravel road and Ava pedaled slowly while Atlas trotted at her side, his gait unusually stiff, his head constantly swiveling toward the tree line. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of warm dust and something else, something metallic and unfamiliar, that made Atlas lift his nose sharply before positioning himself between Ava and the roadside ditch with almost surgical precision. She noticed the tension rippling beneath his fur, his steps tightening into the controlled, deliberate movements he once used during search operations, and a faint unease curled in her stomach. Moments later, the distant growl of engines drifted across the evening stillness, low and deliberate. Not the random passing of travelers, but a coordinated hum that rose and fell as though the riders were pacing themselves. Atlas stopped dead in the road, his tail lowering, his muscles locked, his ears pointed like arrows toward the sound. The rumble faded, but he didn't move, staring with laser focus at a seemingly empty curve beyond the ridge. Ava waited, one hand resting on her handlebars, the other brushing against Atlas's back for reassurance. But the reassurance never came. Only the lingering dread that he knew something she didn't. When they finally made their way home, Atlas paused at the front door and scanned the yard twice, then again before entering, as though committing every detail to memory. He didn't leave her side the rest of the night, lying at the foot of her bed with his head up, eyes open, body still braced for a threat that had yet to reveal itself. The following days didn't ease the tension. Instead, the signs layered one atop another like storm clouds thickening in a sky too quiet to trust. Tire tracks appeared along the roadside where no one in their rural community usually traveled. The old bridge where Ava loved to play had fresh scuff marks on its wooden planks, wide and angled as though someone had kicked off a motorcycle stand or dragged a heavy boot across it. Ava's father noticed the tracks but dismissed them. Teenagers maybe, messing around where they shouldn't. But Atlas reacted differently. He leaned down, sniffing deeply along the planks, his fur rising in a subtle crest down his spine, his body hardening into a rigid line of alertness that startled Ava enough to step backward. And then, as if confirming something only he could interpret, he growled, not the deep, aggressive growl of defiance, but the low, trembling rumble of warning. Ava reached for him, her small hand gripping his ruff, but Atlas didn't move until he was certain the area was clear. That night he paced more than he slept, making quiet circuits from her bedroom to the hallway, to the back door, and back again, his nails tapping softly on the hardwood floor like a metronome marking the passing of anxious hours. By the next week, the bikers were no longer distant sounds but flickers of movement on the horizon, dark shapes cresting the far hill before dipping quickly out of sight, never close enough to identify but always close enough for Atlas to sense. Twice, during their evening rides, he forced Ava off the road and into the safety of the trees with sudden, urgent pressure from his body, nudging her relentlessly until she complied. She never heard the danger, never saw what he detected. But each time they hid there, crouched among the pines with her small fingers twisted in his collar, she felt his heart pounding with a fierce, rhythmic urgency that frightened her more than the unseen threat itself. When she whispered to her parents about Atlas acting strange, they reassured her gently, reminding her that he was trained to be alert and that old habits die hard. But Ava knew better. This wasn't habit, it was instinct, sharp and burning. One afternoon while Ava played in the yard, drawing chalk patterns on the driveway, Atlas stiffened mid-step and lifted his head suddenly, nostrils flaring. Without warning, he moved in front of her, blocking her view of the road, body angled protectively as the faint rumble of motorcycles drifted through the air. This time the sound didn't fade, it grew louder, steadier, more organized. Ava froze as Atlas pressed closer, positioning her behind him, his stance shifting from calm vigilance to unmistakable readiness. The motorcycles never came into sight, turning off somewhere beyond the bend, but their presence left the air charged with adrenaline. It took several minutes before Atlas relaxed, though relaxed was hardly the word. He simply transitioned from full alertness to simmering tension, pacing the perimeter of the yard like a sentry guarding a fortress. Ava watched him with her chest tight, sensing the unspoken message. The distance between them and the threat was shrinking. What unsettled her most was how Atlas changed at home. The once calm, steady shepherd now reacted to every unfamiliar sound. A truck backfiring miles away, a door shutting next door, the distant slam of garbage bins, with instant precision. He began sleeping at the front door instead of at her side, ears perked, head raised, as though expecting someone to step onto the porch under the cover of night. Twice he woke the family with sharp, rapid barks directed toward the empty driveway, his body planted firmly between Ava's bedroom and the front window. Her father checked each time, found nothing, and still brushed it off, not wanting to frighten his daughter. But Ava saw how even he had begun glancing more often toward the road, his brows pulled tight with unease. The unspoken fear settled over the house like dust, quiet but impossible to ignore. The final escalation came on a humid Friday afternoon. Ava decided to ride to the old bridge, her favorite place to unwind after a long, stifling week of summer heat. Atlas followed, sticking so close that his shoulder brushed her leg with every turn of the pedals. When they reached the bridge, Ava stopped, noticing the way Atlas's ears twitched rapidly, his nose working overtime as though scanning invisible currents in the air. She knelt beside him, her hand sinking into the thick fur of his neck, and whispered reassurance he didn't seem to hear. The silence felt wrong, too heavy, too expectant, and then, from beyond the hill, the unmistakable echo of motorcycles burst into the air like a warning siren. Not one this time, not two, but several, roaring together in a synchronized wave that rattled the wooden boards beneath their feet. Atlas lunged toward Ava with sudden, fierce urgency, pressing her behind the railing of the bridge, his body a solid barrier between her and the approaching danger. The engines were closed now, too close, growing louder by the second, and Ava's pulse hammered against her ribs as she crouched low, clinging to Atlas's flank, his breathing slowed, deep and controlled, his posture lowering into something she had only seen once before on the old training videos her father showed her. Combat readiness, precise and unyielding. The bikers appeared over the hill moments later, dark silhouettes against the glaring sun, their helmets glinting, their formation tight. They weren't riding like travelers passing through, they were scanning the road, searching. Atlas remained frozen in place, eyes narrowed, tail stiff, his entire body carved from tension as he calculated every movement, every threat, every possible escape route. One of the riders slowed, turning his head toward the bridge, and for a breathless moment Ava felt certain they had been seen. Her fingers trembled against Atlas's fur, grounding herself as the group rumbled closer, their presence swallowing the peaceful evening and replacing it with an electric pressure that prickled against her skin. The riders lingered near the bridge, their engines idling like predators breathing low, and Atlas shifted minutely, a subtle adjustment that shielded her more fully, telling her without words not to move. Then, as quickly as they appeared, the bikers accelerated, tearing past in a burst of noise that shook the railing. Ava didn't dare breathe until the sound faded entirely. But Atlas didn't relax. He stood rigid, staring down the road long after the threat had vanished, as though waiting for something else, something worse, to emerge from the silence left behind. And when he finally turned toward Ava, there was something different in his gaze, something sharp and decisive. He nudged her bicycle firmly, then looked toward home with a commanding intensity, urging her to move, to get away, to hurry. She obeyed, pedaling fast, Atlas running at her side with unmatched speed, his vigilance heightened to a level she'd never seen. As they reached the edge of their driveway, he suddenly stopped, blocking her path, his head snapping toward the road behind them. Ava followed his gaze and froze. For the first time, a single motorcycle stood still at the far end of the straightaway, engine humming, rider motionless, watching them. The bike wasn't approaching, wasn't leaving. It simply waited. Atlas lowered his head, his stance shifting into something unmistakably protective and dangerously resolute. And in that suspended moment, Ava felt the breath leave her lungs as she realized the truth: the danger wasn't approaching anymore. It had arrived. The moment the lone motorcycle idled at the end of the road, a chilling stillness swallowed the world around Ava, the air tightening like a wire pulled to its breaking point as Atlas positioned himself in front of her, his body angled into a perfect shield, every muscle locked in trained, deliberate readiness. The rider didn't move at first, simply watching, helmet reflecting the dying sun with an eerie, mirrored coldness, and then, slowly, he lifted one hand and motioned, a silent beckon that made Ava's heart slam painfully against her ribs. Before she could even process the gesture, the silence shattered as three more bikes emerged from behind the ridge, engines roaring in a coordinated advance that throbbed through the ground beneath her feet. Panic surged, hot and overwhelming. But Atlas held steady, eyes fixed, reading danger in a language she could not understand. The riders fanned out as they approached, forming a rough semicircle that boxed Ava and Atlas in against the long stretch of their driveway, tires crunching over gravel as they closed the distance with predatory calm. One rider reached into his jacket, and Atlas responded instantly, stepping forward, head lowered, shoulders rolling in a lethal, controlled movement that warned them without a single sound that he would not allow them another inch toward the girl. Ava's breath caught as the man pulled out not a weapon, but a patch, faded, torn, and unmistakable. bearing the emblem of a disbanded biker gang her father had once helped dismantle during Atlas's service years. Her pulse stuttered as the realization struck they weren't random strangers. They knew Atlas, they knew her father, and they were here because of what Atlas had done long before he became her protector. The nearest rider revved his engine in a threat as another pointed at Ava, and everything inside her screamed to run, but Atlas made the decision for her. He lunged sideways, slamming his body into her bicycle, toppling her into the grass just as the first rider accelerated toward them in a burst of gravel. Ava scrambled backward on her elbows, grass stinging her skin, but Atlas was already charging forward with explosive speed, a blur of power and instinct, cutting directly across the rider's path. The motorcycle swerved violently, but Atlas was faster. He hurled his body into the front wheel with enough force to send the rider skidding across the gravel in a spray of dust and metal. The crash ignited chaos. Two more bikers roared toward the dog with a fury that shook the ground, circling him as he spun, calculating, staying between them and Ava with immaculate precision. One rider leaped off his bike and lunged toward Ava on foot, but Atlas intercepted, launching upward with a controlled strike that knocked the man backward with a guttural cry, sending him sprawling across the dirt. Ava crawled toward the porch, her lungs burning, her vision blurred with tears. But when she glanced back, her heart twisted with terror. Atlas was surrounded. The remaining riders advanced together, engines screaming as they circled him tighter and tighter like wolves around a cornered guardian, dust swirling in a choking cloud. Atlas's paws dug into the ground, tail stiff, breath steady, reading their movements with the disciplined calm of a seasoned officer. And then one of the riders made a fatal mistake. He dismounted and reached for Ava once more. In that split second, everything inside Atlas snapped into decisive, unstoppable action. He broke from the circle with a burst of speed so sudden the riders couldn't adjust, sprinting low and fast, kicking up dust as he crossed the yard in long, powerful strides, reaching Ava just as the man's shadow fell over her. The intruder grabbed her wrist, yanking her upward with a roughness that sent pain shooting through her arm, but Atlas was already airborne, teeth closing on the man's sleeve, dragging his grip off the girl with a force that sent them both tumbling. Ava crashed down hard, grass scratching her palms, but she didn't let go of Atlas's training collar, fingers clutching it like a lifeline. The bikers roared in furious unison now, engines rising in a deafening crescendo as they prepared to swarm, but Atlas suddenly stiffened beside her, ears snapping forward, muscles coiling. He glanced at Ava, one sharp, meaningful look, and then lifted his paw, a signal. The same signal he had given the day the bikers first appeared, the one he had only ever used in moments of extreme threat during his service years. It was a call for backup, a command for help, a signal meant for police partners, meant for her father. And before Ava could understand what he intended, Atlas unleashed a sound she had never heard from him, a deep, resonant bark that wasn't just a warning, but a message, a beacon, a declaration. The bikers froze for a fraction of a second, and in that sliver of time, the world erupted with the wail of sirens rising from beyond the trees, growing louder, closer, faster than the bikers could react. Ava's father's voice echoed distantly, shouting orders as police vehicles burst onto the road in a surge of flashing lights. The bikers scrambled in panic, engines revving as they tried to flee, but officers closed in from both directions, trapping them in a chaotic grid of metal and blinding blue strobes. The final rider attempted to escape on foot, sprinting toward the woods, but Atlas tore after him with a breathtaking burst of speed, tackling him to the ground with a precision that stunned even the officers who had once watched him work. Ava collapsed to her knees, trembling, breath shaking as the chaos unfolded around her. Sirens screaming, men shouting, gravel scattering under boots. But her eyes never left the dog who now stood motionless, chest rising and falling in steady, controlled breaths as officers closed in on the subdued rider beneath his paws. And when her father finally reached her, pulling her into a trembling embrace, Ava looked past him at the dog who had never once left her side, even when danger closed in from every direction. Atlas turned toward her then, amber eyes softening as if to say he had kept his promise, the same unspoken vow he had made on the first day he lay beside her bed. The officers secured the last of the bikers, engines quieted, and the dust slowly settled across the battered gravel road. But Ava saw only Atlas standing tall against the dying light, a guardian forged by loyalty, sharpened by courage, and driven by a love deeper than fear. And in that moment, as the final echoes of danger faded, One truth struck her with breathtaking clarity: Atlas hadn't just saved her life. He had chosen her over everything else. The hours that followed unfolded in a haze of flashing lights, hurried voices, and the heavy pulse of adrenaline slowly draining from Ava's trembling limbs, leaving her exhausted, shaken, and struggling to piece together everything that had just happened. Officers moved methodically around the scene, securing evidence, questioning the captured riders, and marking the gouges in the gravel where motorcycles had skidded and where Atlas had thrown himself into harm's way without a single moment of hesitation. The fading light of evening stretched long shadows across the yard, blending into the softer glow of emergency lights that washed the grass in shifting shades of blue and red. Ava sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket one of the officers had draped over her shoulders, her scraped palms burning with every pulse of her heartbeat, her mind returning again and again to the terrifying images she couldn't shake. Atlas charging into the path of a bike, the man's grip on her wrist, her father's distant shouts blending with the roar of engines. But as overwhelming as the memories were, one image anchored her through the storm: Atlas standing at the center of it all, steady and unbroken, watching her even when surrounded by danger. Now, in the aftermath, he sat close beside her, his thick fur pressed against her thigh as if grounding her in the present, his breath warm and rhythmic, his body still humming with residual tension even as he tried to appear calm for her sake. She leaned into him instinctively, burying her fingers in the familiar softness of his ruff, drawing strength from the one constant in a world that had suddenly felt so fragile. Her father stood a few yards away, speaking in low, urgent tones with the officers who had responded. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw tight, and though he tried to maintain the composed posture of a trained police officer, Ava could see the tremor in his hands every time he paused to glance toward her, confirming again and again that she was safe. When he finally returned to the porch, he knelt in front of her with an expression she had never seen before: fear, relief, pride, and heartbreak all woven together. He pulled her into a fierce embrace, squeezing as though reminding himself she was real, alive, and whole. When he released her, his gaze shifted to Atlas, and something deep and reverent flickered across his features. He reached out, resting one hand on the dog's broad head, and though no words were spoken, the gratitude radiating from him was unmistakable. For a long moment, the three of them remained like that. Ava wrapped in the blanket, her father kneeling, Atlas pressed protectively at her side, bound together by the shared trauma of what had happened and the overwhelming relief that they had survived. As the officers finished their work, one of them approached with a gentle, reassuring presence, explaining that the bikers were members of a dismantled gang seeking retaliation against her father for arrests made years earlier, arrests that had been possible largely because of Atlas's work as a K-9. They had learned where the family lived, they had watched, they had waited. The realization felt like a cold weight settling in Ava's chest, yet the officer's voice softened as he explained how Atlas's instincts had been the first line of defense, how his alert behavior, his signals, his refusal to leave her side had likely prevented far worse outcomes. Ava listened with wide eyes, gripping Atlas more tightly with every word, understanding for the first time just how deeply his loyalty ran, not just in training, not in duty, but in love. He hadn't simply been protecting her out of instinct, he had chosen to stay vigilant for her, long before the danger revealed itself. When the sun finally slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the sky washed in muted blues, Ava's mother arrived home from work in a panicked rush, running toward the porch with tears already streaming down her cheeks. She swept Ava into her arms, rocking her gently, whispering frantic words that Ava barely heard. Only when her mother's breathing eased did she notice Atlas watching them closely, head tilted, eyes softening at the sight of their embrace. Her mother reached out to him with shaking hands, stroking his fur with reverence, whispering her own quiet thanks as though she understood that words alone could never fully express what the dog had done for their family. That night, after the last police car pulled away and the house finally quieted, Ava found it impossible to sleep. Her room felt unfamiliar, shadows too dark, silence too loud. Every time she closed her eyes, the roar of engines surged back into her mind, along with the image of the rider grabbing her wrist. She curled beneath her blanket, heart racing. But before the panic could take hold, a familiar weight pressed gently against the side of her bed. Atlas had entered without a sound, settling on the floor beside her, his presence anchoring her like a lighthouse in a storm. She leaned over the edge of the bed, letting her hand rest on his neck, tracing the warm, steady rise and fall of his breath. In that quiet moment, the fear loosened its grip on her chest, replaced by a soft, fragile calm. She whispered a trembling "thank you," her voice cracking. And though Atlas couldn't respond in words, he lifted his head just enough to nudge her palm with his nose. A promise that he was there, that he would always be there. Over the next few days, the house filled with visitors. Officers, neighbors, even people from down the road who had heard fragments of the story. Each one came with gratitude, with praise, with awe for Atlas's bravery. But while the adults talked in serious tones and shook hands over grim conclusions, Ava and Atlas retreated to their quiet rituals, rebuilding normalcy in small pieces. They walked the yard together, sat beneath the maple tree with the soft summer breeze rustling the leaves, and resumed their quiet companionship as though stitching together the moments that danger had torn apart. Yet something had undeniably changed. Ava felt safer near him than she ever had, but also more aware of the vulnerability surrounding them. She watched him now with deeper appreciation. How he scanned their surroundings, how he positioned himself between her and unfamiliar noises, how his body remained calm but poised, ready at any moment to protect. She realized his loyalty was not passive. It was active, fierce, and grounded in something far more powerful than obedience. It was love, steadfast and unwavering. Her father, too, saw Atlas through renewed eyes. He often paused in the doorways or from across the yard, watching the dog with a mixture of pride and awe, as though seeing the partner he once trained now transformed into something even greater. A guardian not bound by duty but by devotion. One evening he sat beside Ava on the porch with Atlas stretched across both their feet. He told her stories about Atlas's early years on the force. How he had once tracked a missing child for miles through dense woods. How he had stood unflinching in the face of danger countless times. How he had always been the dog who reacted not with aggression, but with precision and heart. Ava listened, her fingers buried in Atlas's fur, feeling the weight of his history settle around them, connecting his past bravery with the courage he had shown for her. As the days slipped into weeks, the raw fear faded, replaced by a deeper, richer connection that wove Ava and Atlas even tighter together. He became more than her protector, more than her companion. He became the anchor to her courage, the quiet reminder that even in moments of darkness, loyalty could illuminate a path back to safety. And gradually, the nightmares eased, replaced by dreams of running with him across open fields, sunlight warm on their faces, the threat of danger a distant memory. One afternoon, months after the incident, Ava returned to the old bridge for the first time. She approached slowly, her breath steady but her heartbeat quick with echoes of the past. Atlas walked beside her, his posture calm but attentive, eyes scanning the horizon with familiar precision. When they reached the center of the bridge, Ava knelt and placed her hand on the worn wooden planks, tracing the faded marks left from the biker's boots, now softened by weather and time. Atlas sat beside her, leaning gently into her shoulder, as though offering silent support. Together they faced the place where fear had once overwhelmed her, and in that quiet victory, she felt the weight of healing settle over her like the warm glow of afternoon sun. She looked up at Atlas then, meeting his amber eyes, and though neither spoke, the moment was filled with an unspoken truth. They had survived together, and they had grown stronger because of it. In the months that followed, people continued to speak of Atlas as a hero. Neighbors, officers, even strangers who heard the story through local news. But for Ava, the word hero felt too simple, too small, too incomplete. Atlas was the embodiment of loyalty, the living reminder that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to protect someone even when danger loomed in every direction. He had saved her not just from harm, but from the lasting shadows of fear, and in doing so, he had given her more than safety. He had given her strength. And so, in the quiet moments of late evenings when the world felt soft and peaceful again, Ava often found herself resting her head against Atlas's broad shoulder, whispering the truth she had come to understand, that real courage lies not in the loud moments of battle, but in the silent promise of a heart that refuses to give up on the ones it loves. And in Atlas she had found the purest form of that courage, the kind that stands firm when danger rises, the kind that chooses love over fear, the kind that leaves a mark on a life forever.